What's up guys, Rotozap here, and today we're going to be trying to solve what I feel is really the biggest problem in Wizard101 PvP right now, which is Shadow Pip balancing issues. So, this is something that we've been complaining about as a community for a very long time, but despite this, there really hasn't been any changes. But I feel like there's been a lot more pressure on KingsIsle as of recently to make changes to this. And also KingsIsle has exhibited that they are a little more interested in hearing what the community has to say than they ever have been previously. So that being said, this video is going to try and solve the problem in the most logical way possible using a combination of various suggestions that I've seen from other people and a couple things that I've come up with myself, or at least I think I did. But, who knows. But anyway, that's all I gotta say. Let's get right into it. So the two categories of suggestions that I've seen are what I like to call rule add-ons, or things that don't fundamentally change the way in which shadow pips work or are acquired, kind of, but they're more or less just things that are, oh, by the way, with shadow pips, this is also now a thing. And the other category would be game alterations. So things that, again, fundamentally change the way in which shadow pips either work or how they're acquired. So I think the first one to go over is probably going to be the rule add-ons, because I think that's the best way to start this off. And the first one is one that I agree with a lot. And it's not one that I've come up with, but it's one that I've seen a lot, which is that you shouldn't be able to use shadow pips while you're in Shrike. And I think that this is really important for a couple of reasons. If you take a look at the Shrike card, it does 50% pierce and 10 outgoing damage. That's insane. Okay, when you put this in tandem with spells that have a base of, somewhere in the ballpark of, after enchanted, of course, 13 to 1400 damage, being able to pierce all of your opponent's resistance and getting a damage boost, while also being able to use these low pip, extremely high damage spells, it's just a recipe for disaster, and it has been a recipe for disaster. Because especially from first, if your opponent gets 2 shadow pips from first, especially if you haven't gotten any yet, there's really not a whole lot you can do, because the problem with Shrike is that you can't prevent the damage using shields, because they'll pierce your shield, and after the first hit of Shrike, they'll be getting pierce blades every single time that they hit you. So you can't really prevent them with shields. The only thing you can actually do is use like weaknesses and try to limit the initial damage in order to mitigate it as best you can. But it just doesn't do enough. You just kind of have to accept that you're going to be fully pierced when your opponent goes into Strike. And again, when you combine that with spells that have a base damage of like 1400 and really powerful after effects, like, Weaver, for example, puts on a 75 shield, FFA puts on a fuel, gaze, damage bubble. When you put these all in combination, it's just broken, and there's nothing that a player can do from second to really stop it. So that's why I think it's a really important one to implement. The other one that I'm really not so sure about, I'm going to go over it in a little bit, but I think that we should really only implement this if the game was altered in a certain way. But that is, of course, not letting your opponent get shadow pips while they're in Shrike. So on top of not being able to use the shadow pips that they maybe already had in Shrike, they also cannot acquire any more while they're in Shrike. And, I don't really like shadow pips, but so like from my perspective, it's like, why not? Why not just add in more rules and make shadow pips as weak as physically possible? But from a logical side of things, I don't really see why this is necessary. In fact, by its very nature, it seems unnecessary, because if you're already preventing your opponent from using shadow pips while in Shrike, it doesn't necessarily matter if they're getting more of them, because they still can't do anything while they're in Shrike. But again, though, I can see a valid argument as to why you would want this implemented, because as soon as they come out of Shrike, they're going to have 2. And they might be able to hit you twice with 2 shadow hits, and that's kind of broken. Sure, I can see that, but what they cannot do is go back into strike and hit you again with a shadow pip. So it's a slippery slope, but I feel like I could see the argument going either way. But this is something that I don't really feel needs to be implemented unless we were doing a certain game alteration that I'm going to talk about. But yeah, so that one's kind of iffy. But the next one is something that I keep saying, the game alteration. I cannot wait to share with you guys my amazing idea here. But yeah, this one is kind of taken care of by the game alteration that I think is best suited for the situation. But it is, of course, limiting shadow pips in a way so that you can only get them after a certain number of rounds after the game has begun. Meaning, you can't just start the game off with a shad. You shouldn't ever be able to start the game off with a shad. That's broken. That's stupid. If you're going second and the player you're going against is first and they get a shadow pip very first round, there is nothing that you can do. They get a free open 5 pip shadow pip enhance pip. You can tell I'm annoyed. But the point being, your opponent gets a free open shot with one of these extremely strong spells for literally no reason. Like, it's not punishment for bad play on your opponent's part. It's just because first and because shadow pips. That's not really how the game should work. So I think that this is another one that, you know, if the game alteration that I have in mind isn't implemented, that this needs to be a necessity, because the game alteration that I had in mind already kind of takes care of this by its nature. However, if it's not implemented, then I would definitely need this to be a thing, because it's so annoying when they get a shadow pip first or second round and you're going second, and there's just literally nothing you can do. They just get an open shot on you, does 2, 3, maybe even 4,000 damage, and there's just nothing that could have been done to prevent it. It's really frustrating. But anyway, yeah, and then the final game rule add-on here is one that I feel like I think I've come up with this. I haven't seen anyone talk about this before, but I could be wrong. And that is the idea of diminishing shadow pip chances, exponentially diminishing chances. So what that means is, let's say you get a shadow pip. Okay, your chances of getting your next shadow pip are now lower than they originally were. So let's just say your chances were 50%. They were not ever 50, that's not a thing, but I'm just using easy numbers here. So let's say your chances were originally 50%. Okay, then you get a shadow pip. Okay, now they go down to 30%. Okay, but then you still get a second shadow pip. Now your chances are down to 10%. Okay, and then after 10%, let's just say you're just a shadow god and you get another shadow pip. Now they're down to 5%, and then they just keep lowering and sort of, like I said, an exponential curve. So it's just going to keep diminishing and diminishing by percentage values. So this would solve quite a few things, because yeah, sure, you might be able to get the first shadow pip pretty easily, but then your chances of consecutively getting more and more shadow pips are just lowering. So I think that this would be an interesting thing to implement, but it's also in conflict with the game alteration that I had in mind. So again, this is kind of something that I think would be worth checking out if they don't want to implement my game alteration. But I am so confident in this game alteration being the best possible one. But yeah, so that's all I've got to say about rule add-ons. Those 4, I think that, you know, generally a lot of them are good ideas to implement, if not all of them, depending on what the new rules are for shadow pips. But yeah, that's all I've got to say about that. So going into now the game alterations. So the very first one, I'm not even going to talk about it for more than a minute, hopefully, because it's not going to happen, guys. It's not going to happen. So just everyone needs to get the idea out of their head now, because it's really not even worth entertaining the idea of it happening. And I'm of course talking about just outright removing shadow pips, just making shadow pips no PvP, no muss, no fuss, no one has to deal with them ever again. It's not going to happen. It's just not. King's Eye, I've been playing this game for over 10 years. I will tell you right now with 100% confidence, King's Isle is not going to just cut shadow pips. I can guarantee it. There needs to be some sort of compromise, but just removing them outright is not going to be the compromise that they settle on. It's not going to be something that they are willing to do. They are integral to the story of the game, and they've put a lot of time into shadow pips and things of that nature. So they're not going to just remove them. I can literally guarantee it. But that's all I've got to say about it. It's just, that's not how it's going to work out. So just, I'm not even going to go into why or why not. It's a good idea because it's just not going to happen. But the next thing is my idea, and I think that this is the most logical way to tackle the problem, and that is set turns in which you gain shadow pips. So for example, every certain amount of turns both players would gain a shadow pip. And something else I'd be willing to kind of entertain is if the player going second got them a round before. So let me put you in a scenario here. So let's say you've got player 1 and player 2, okay? Player 2 is going second. Every 5 rounds is when a shadow pip is distributed. So on round 4, the player 2 gets it. On round 5, player 1 gets it. And then on round 9, player 2 gets another one. On round 10, the player 1 gets it. So here's why this is just by far the best idea, and why I think that, you know, maybe implementing the rule about not being able to gain shadow pips in Strike would make things pretty interesting if you were to implement this. Because if you think about it, if the player isn't keeping track of their turns and just willy-nilly goes into Strike, they might bar themselves from being able to get their shadow pip for the round or their shadow pip for the every 5 rounds because they're in Strike while their round was occurring. So this would add a lot more strategy to the game because you'd have to keep track of whose turn it is, when are you going to be getting a shadow pip, and plan accordingly for your opponent, right? So there's definitely some counter arguments to be made for this being the definitive fix for PvP, because some people may argue that, well, yes, this does solve everything in relation to luck with PvP. It doesn't really tackle the issue of, well, a player going first could easily be like, okay, I know for a fact that I am getting a shadow pip next round, so as long as I break his shield or, you know, do something, it makes it really easy to combo into your shadow hit. Like, let's say, for example, your opponent doesn't currently have a shield on you and they don't have stun blocks on either. You know, you could just stun them into a shadow hit and it would be open, but it would be guaranteed because you'd know that you're getting a shadow pip on that turn. But to that, I would really argue that, you know, if your opponent was also aware of this, then they could plan accordingly, right? They would put on stun blocks and they would put on shields. And keep in mind, the player going second, I think, would be only fair for them to get the shadow pip a round early. So your opponent can't do anything too cheeky in preparation, because if they let their guard down, then they're going to get hit with a shadow pip spell, or their opponent's just going to go freely into Strike. So I think that there's definitely some merit behind questioning why this would be the best thing, but I think if you look at all of our options and all of the ways to just fundamentally change how shadow pips work, I think that this just makes the most sense, because number one, like I said, it takes all the luck out of the game. There is no luck involved. Everything is now pure strategy, pure knowing, okay, I'm going to get a shadow pip on this round. And when you put it in tandem with other rules, like the fact that you can't use shadow pips in Strike, it prevents the player from abusing the whole thing of like, okay, well maybe if I just save up for 10 rounds and then use a Shadow Pip and then blah 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 blah. It doesn't allow for that. And it even does allow for players that are using different strategies, for example my lovely Balance, who uses the Nova strategy. If I knew that I was going to get 2 Shadow Pips by round 10 or 9, that makes my strategy a lot easier, and it makes preparing to Nova a lot easier for me. So I feel like it takes out so many birds with one stone. I don't understand how else things could be fixed, because I feel like the only way to really fix this problem is by taking some of the rule add-ons and applying them to an alteration. Just something has to be fundamentally changed about how Shadow Pips work, and then I think on top of that, we've got to implement some brand new rules that help keep that alteration in check. And that's what we're kind of doing here. We're combining the brand new way of doing things, which would be set turns in which players earn Shadow Pips, in combination with the fact that you're not allowed to use them while in Strike, you're not allowed to gain them while in Strike, and I mean, that's really kind of it. But like, you guys see the point. So if you guys agree with this, if you guys think that this really is the best way of doing things, I've been seeing a lot of people talk about suggestions and whatnot, but I have not seen anyone talk about this whole set thing. Like, just everyone gets Shadow Pips on certain turns. I really have not seen many people talking about this, but I feel like if you really break it down, it is by far the best way to solve the problem. So that's all I've got to say for this video. Let me know in the comments how you guys would fix Shadow Pips. I don't know if you'll be able to convince me, because I am pretty convinced at this point that this is the best way to do it. But I am, of course, open to other suggestions, other ways of doing things. So that's really all I've got to say, guys. If you enjoy the video, you have suggestions, you leave them below, right? But that's all I've got to say. Rosap out. Peace.